Being adaptable and flexible have always been a hallmark of effective leadership. But how can government leaders see constant change as an opportunity and not a threat? How can fostering a flux mindset help leaders be more effective and resilient in the face of relentless uncertainty? And what strategies can leaders employ to achieve a flux mindset? I will explore these questions and much more with April Rinne, author of Flux, 8 Superpowers for Thriving in Constant Change. April, welcome to the show. It's great to have you.
Thank you, Michael. I'm delighted to be here.
So have you on to discuss your book, Flux, 8 Superpowers for Thriving in Constant Change. I was wondering, humans really struggle with change, especially change we do not choose. Given your research, why is that the case?
Yeah, it's a great sort of $1 trillion question, I think, to start off with. So let's go big. It's very interesting. So my book is really about our relationship to change. And I think this is a theme we'll be coming back to again and again. But we often think of change as like this, almost a one-size-fits-all thing. It's one word, change. And yet change is really complicated and it's really messy and it's really many different flavors and colors. And, there are changes that we love as humans, new adventures, new relationships, new experiences. There are changes we hate. And this is to your question, changes we hate. Those are the changes we didn't expect. Those are the ones that are unwelcome. Those are the ones that truly feel and are beyond our control. And we don't like those changes because I guess you can think of it at a certain basic level as fundamental human nature. We want to survive. Survival often means familiarity, even if it's subpar. It means predictability. It means status quo because you're alive in the status quo and you may not be if it changes. And I'm using the term survival broadly. But what's interesting is as we're in a world where there just seems to be more change, a faster pace of change all around, before you've responded or reacted to one change, something else has hit. We really struggle with that. It's human nature to be thrown off balance. And that's not a bad thing. That's kind of how we've adapted. As I like to say, the only reason we're here today is because of change. But the challenge we face is that more and more, there's more change on many different metrics, but there is more change that is beyond our control, may not even impact us directly, but we know about it. And that tends to put our brains into hyperdrive in ways that aren't helpful to us. And so that's where I look at this and I say, casting the vision, casting the net forward, we have got to be able to reshape our relationship to change, especially that change we didn't choose, in order to have a healthy and productive outlook about the future.
So right now, April, I want to get into the crux of your book. What is flux? And would you elaborate on your theory of flux?
Yeah. So I'll get to the theory of flux in a minute. And it's not heavy-handed academic. It's not a theory like that. It's very much a practical layperson's view of, so what are we trying to unpack with flux and how do we get from A to B to C, so to speak? But just pausing for a moment and going back to the word flux. This is one of my favorite things to talk about because I didn't land on the word flux, 25 years ago. It took time and kind of riffing on a bunch of different concepts and connecting different dots and thinking about change. And then, flux is this very fun word. People, they've heard of it, but they're like, oh, it's intriguing. And there are lots of ways you can riff on it. But what's interesting to me is that flux is both a noun and a verb. As a noun, which is how most people know it, flux means continuous change. Okay. Flux is also a verb, and as a verb, it means to learn to become fluid. And I love this because I think in many ways, the world is in flux today, and we need to learn how to flux, how to become more fluid, how to not necessarily see so much as black and white, or, plans are either going to go as I hope or fall apart. Change is either good or bad. But to be much more kind of permeable, much more porous as we think about and relate to change. So I love putting that out there as a primer because a lot of times people are like, okay, I've struggled with change in some respect over the last, year or many years. And when you put it in that context of what we're trying to get at with Flux, it helps people kind of open up, like start softening your brain a little bit, which is actually a perfect segue to the theory of Flux, which candidly, just to make it really simple, the theory of Flux is how we ended up where we are today and how we need to get to a better place moving forward in terms of our relationship to change. And I've divided the theory of Flux up, or broken it down, I guess you could say, into 3 steps. And so just very briefly, because I think we'll dive into each step, the first step is to open what I call a Flux mindset. And that is the ability to see all change, good or bad, loved or hated, unexpected or unwelcomed, as an opportunity, not a threat, and to harness its silver linings. We can come back to that. The second step, once your Flux mindset is opened, and sometimes the easiest way to think of your Flux mindset is to acknowledge that your relationship to change could improve, that it needs some help, needs some work. The second step is to use your Flux mindset to unlock the 8 Flux superpowers. Now, these superpowers are the disciplines and practices and sort of the how to learn how to Flux. And then the third step is to apply your Flux mindset and your Flux superpowers to write your new script. Your script that is fit for a world in flux. So these things they build on each other, but they also then become a bit of a cycle where you can just, I don't want to say rinse, wash, repeat, but the more you groove a Flux mindset, the easier it is to develop your Flux superpowers, the clearer your script becomes, etc.
That's a great point. I was wondering, you make a wonderful distinction between change management and mindset. And, we get overwhelmed. We often feel disoriented. We lose our bearings, direction, and perspective. Trying to figure out, how can a Flux mindset, as you outline it, be that compass for change?
Yeah. And it's a great segue, because when you think about it, we set these strategies. We think we can manage and control change. And then change happens and we get knocked off course. We feel disoriented. The strategy goes out the window or whatever. The way that I like to think about a Flux mindset in this regard and this compass for change, so much of it is about our orientation. And literally, figuratively, orientation has lots of different meanings. But the best way to put it is, what grounds you and roots you and orients you, and fundamentally, what makes you you, even when everything else changes. If you can answer that question, not only are you leaps and bounds ahead on your Flux mindset, you're going to be fine when change hits. It's the people and organizations who are chasing things outside of them that they've identified as, perhaps society has told them this matters, perhaps their family has told them this matters, perhaps this is simply the way things have always been done. But then change hits and it knocks them completely over, because they're not clear on that question. What makes you you, even when everything else changes? And so that's that compass, that kind of homing instinct or homing mechanism, if you will, that you can continue to come back to again and again.
So getting right into it, your subtitle is 8 Superpowers. I'm wondering, can you identify for the audience what those Flux superpowers are? How do each of them help us see change in new ways, kind of help us develop new responses, new scripts to change, and ultimately reshape our relationship to change?
Sure. Happy to. I love the superpowers. And I'll give a very high sort of top line description. But just as a little bit of preface, it was fun because in the course of writing, it wasn't always superpowers. We thought about what's the best way to describe these things. And it was like, well, they're disciplines, they're practices, they're tools, they're skills. They are all of those things. But at the end of the day, they're superpowers. Because if you can master these, and I say master, I use that term lightly, it's a life journey. You're going to be working on these things forever. And that's part of the beauty. But you are going to be so resilient, and beyond resilient, you're going to be able to look at the future, even a future full of change, with joy, with optimism, with a sense that we can do things better. So very briefly, the 8 Flux superpowers. Now, they are, I want you to listen to these and understand them as a menu, not a syllabus. You don't have to do 1 before 2 or 2 before 3. They are all equally valid. They are all standalone, if you will. As you learn one or two, or, as you learn some of them, the others do become easier. So they kind of enhance each other, but they don't depend per se on each other. It's a menu. You could read each superpower is a chapter in the book. So as I like to say, you could read the book backwards. You could read chapter 3 before chapter 5 and then chapter 1, and that's okay. Because they do work together, but they are seen as kind of peers. So the first superpower is run slower. The second superpower is see what's invisible. The third superpower is get lost. Fourth superpower is start with trust. The fifth superpower is know you're enough. The sixth superpower is create your portfolio career. The seventh superpower is be all the more human and serve other humans. And the eighth and final superpower is let go of the future. I know we're going to dive into some of these, but I do also want to bring up one other thing that I'll put out there because it might have already popped up in somebody's head. Each of these superpowers is counterintuitive, a little bit contrarian in some way. So I'm very aware of that, and I love that. It goes back to our scripts. So those are the 8.
And it's a wonderful, I was reading your book and I'm thinking to myself, changing habits, the ability to change habits. When for me, everybody does New Year's resolutions or what have you, or birthday resolutions. And they're like, I want to get rid of something. I want to add something. I've always recognized that whenever I had a new habit to change, the most effective way for me personally was subtracting something. Rather than necessarily adding something new. And so I was wondering, how can subtracting be more helpful when dealing with uncertainty and flux than adding?
Yeah, it's a great question, and you've nailed it. And I love, everyone has some things in their life they wish weren't there. It may be a toxic relationship. It may be too much stuff in your closet. Like, all of those things are actually examples of more. You have too much. You have more than you want, whether it's good or bad. And so at the end of the day, subtracting is helpful when dealing with uncertainty and flux. It's more helpful than adding, I find, because it helps us simplify. And simplify, knowing you're enough means knowing what is your point of sufficiency. Again, not too much, that's excess. Not enough, that's scarcity, and that's hardship as well. But it's your point in which your needs are satisfied. And if you look at the history of the word enough, it's fascinating because it does go back to like, how much could a person carry? How much could a person hold for themselves? That's it. Anything more than that was too much. And so when we're able to subtract something from our life, something that's weighing us down, something that's, and again, this plays out in many different ways. When you have more than you need, it's expensive. You're using resources that the environment could actually really use, could benefit from having back or having never extracted. You're also subtracting, if you will, time that might be spent with other people in other ways that you could add back to things that you really care about. So ultimately, it comes back to that point of simplification. And again, if you know what makes you you, that's the kind of, you simplify with that as your core pillar, so to speak. And a lot of the other stuff that might have felt like noise or just distraction in your head also starts to dissipate. And so you find that kind of clarity. When you can peel back and subtract the stuff, subtract the noise, subtract the stuff that is not helping you show up fully and live your best life, all of a sudden you find that you actually have, quote unquote, more time to focus on what you really do care about, what really does matter. So again, a kind of paradox, but when we think about it, it makes a lot of sense.
I was wondering, we went through the 8 superpowers, and just wondering the insights of your book. You mentioned that you've worked with governments at all levels, and I'm wondering, perhaps you could share with us how a government executive or a government agency could use the insights in your book to effectively meet their missions.
Yeah, thank you. It's a wonderful question. And again, I'm like, we could spend an hour here, but And actually, I should say it's a seed that was planted years ago that ultimately led me to write the book, was what I experienced in governments around the world in different ways, but it was pretty consistent. And I think it probably won't come as a surprise, that sense that on the whole, and this is not a criticism in any way, not any way, shape, or form. And I say this as a lawyer where I'm like, some things are even slower. But on the whole, governments change fairly slowly in terms of what does it take to change a government institution or constitutional reform, or political parties come and go. Yes, in some places, but governments, they're there for stability. They're there for the long haul. And I was in a position of trying to bring together government stakeholders and business stakeholders, but also a lot of startups. Now, startups could not be further on the spectrum than governments, I think. Startups are like 1,000 changes before breakfast kind of thing. Startups are changing so fast. They're just running. They're scrappy, but they're change. Trying to get these two groups of stakeholders to not just talk to each other, but to really start to work together was a fascinating experience because and I would say neither the governments nor the startups had a very clear sense of their relationship to change. So one of my biggest insights and kind of basic, first step recommendations is to get clarity on any time you're thinking about your mission, what you're trying to achieve this quarter or this year, how you're trying to forge new partnerships with different sets of stakeholders, et cetera. Take stock of what each stakeholder's, we could say, relationship to change is, but what is their norm when it comes to the pace of change? Are they in a hyper rapid phase of change? And it's just like, that's where their mindset is grooved to, we are only always ever in change. Versus another stakeholder's mindset is, no, we really fight for stability and security and we resist change, right? It sounds almost so simple, yet we don't do that very much. And so one of the easiest, lowest hanging fruit things I would say for governments is to take stock of your own pace of change, relationship to change, and that of your colleagues and that of other departments and so forth. But especially when you reach out to the broader world, the citizens that you serve, the services and departments that you oversee, and so forth, put yourself in their shoes and try to better understand their relationship to change too. Because, it's not like it automatically solves the problem or something, but you do start to better understand where some of your sources of friction are, but also where you might be able to tap in to new kinds of talent, new opportunities, again, that invisible value and so forth that I was talking about before. All of those things start to come to bear when you're clearer on what your relationship to change looks like today and where it may need help. So I would say start there. There's more, but that's a really, I have yet to find anywhere where that initial starting point hasn't been helpful.
How does the concept of leadership change in a world of flux?
It's a wonderful question. And it actually changes a lot. Not to say that it doesn't matter anymore. It matters just as much, but it looks different. So I think historically, humans tend to think of leaders as having certainty. They have the answers. They know what to do. They're at the top of the pyramid or the top of the ladder or whatever, and they oversee everybody else, but they know what to do. That's why we call them leaders. In a world in flux, in a world of constant change, that assumption goes out the window, or I should say it should go out the window, even though when we run into leadership challenges and crises, it's because we're looking to leaders, expecting them to have answers for things that no one knows. What's going to happen tomorrow? When is COVID going to be over? What does our return to the office look like, right? Leaders, quote unquote leaders, it's a CEO, it's a president, take your pick. It's not like they have some wisdom that we don't, that the average population doesn't have. We are all trying to figure this out together. So what this means for leadership in a world in flux, two things I just kind of want to tease out. One is that rather than holding leaders to this metric of certainty, which candidly is impossible, in a world in flux, great leaders don't have certainty. They have clarity. They have clarity of values. They have clarity of mission. They have clarity of where we're trying to get. This goes back to what makes you, you, even when everything else changes. That is clarity. They also have clarity in this regard that they don't have all the answers. And they're unafraid to say that. And they're unafraid to say the only way we're going to figure this out really is together. So that's the second point. So the first one is, rather than certainty, focus on clarity. The second one is to signal to actually, and there's an element of kind of humility in this, very human-centric leadership, to be able to say, I don't have all the answers, but I do know that if we work together, I'm going to invite you, again, you being, think of that as broadly as you wish, inviting others in to help co-create, find the solutions, lead together. So the point there being, great leaders today, and I would say this was the case even before a world in flux, but now it's more like it's in hyperdrive. Great leaders in a world in flux are those who can identify and harness leadership potential in others and bring it to bear, recognizing that in a landscape where nobody knows what's going to happen next, we have to be able to bring as many bright minds, bright ideas together as we can. And that means that actually everybody can step up into a leadership role. So it's not leading from the top down, it's leading together. I don't want to say horizontally per se, but organizational structures do look a little bit different. And, leaders at the top, we would say, they're in a space that is a bit more, they're peers, they're allies, but we're getting through this together. And again, this goes back to trust. This goes back to seeing what's invisible. This goes back to being all the more human. All of those superpowers are packed into it in some way. That is one really clear to me way in which leadership is changing, and I believe will continue to change in this direction.
This has been the Business of Government Hour, a conversation with authors, a special series focusing on leading through uncertain times with April Rinne, author of Flux, 8 Superpowers for Thriving in Constant Change. Be sure to join us next time for another informative, insightful, and in-depth conversation on improving government leadership and its effectiveness. Until then, subscribe, download, and listen to the entire interview at Podcast One, iTunes, or on your favorite podcast app. And as always, at businessofgovernment.org.